Good evening, I'm Gavin Jackson. Welcome to South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio's live coverage of the state's 2022 election. The polls have been closed across the state for 1 hour, and the Associated Press has already declared several winners. Republican Senator Tim Scott was declared the winner right when the polls closed at 7 o'clock. He beat Democrat Crystal Matthews. Results continue to come in, but Governor Henry McMaster is leading over Democrat Joe Cunningham right now. And Congressman Jeff Duncan of District 3 and William Timmons of District 4 have been declared the winners of their races. They were running unopposed. We will continue to follow the results for the next few hours. We will also be getting live reports from several different locations, including South Carolina Public Radio's Thelisha Eaddy at the McMaster-Evatt headquarters in Columbia, where other Republican candidates are also located. And South Carolina Public Radio's Victoria Hansen is at the Cunningham-Casey headquarters in Charleston, where 1st Congressional District Democratic nominee Dr. Annie Andrews is also located. Joining us in studio to discuss the races and the outcomes is Kirk Randazzo. He's a political science professor and department chair at the University of South Carolina. Kirk, welcome. It's still very early in the night. Like we said, it's 8 o'clock, but we already know what happened in that U.S. Senate race with Tim Scott. Tell us about some of your initial impressions on the races so far.
I would say right now the results that we have, I don't think should surprise anybody that's been following politics in this state, both in terms of the governor leading Joe Cunningham right now, but certainly in terms of Senator Tim Scott getting reelected.
Especially because Tim Scott, you know, we're in a Republican state, obviously Republican running statewide, one of the most popular politicians in the state as well. I mean, people love Tim Scott, but this is also supposed to be his last 6-year stint as a senator too. Should we read into that more? Obviously, there's a lot of 2024 buzz, but what do you think about Tim Scott's future at this point?
Well, I think his future is incredibly bright. Tim Scott has an amazing message that just resonates with everyday voters. He has a phenomenal story that can relate to the average person. And I think there are a lot of people in the Republican Party that would love to see him run for the presidency. And whether it's in 2024 or maybe 2028, I certainly think his star is on the rise, and we will continue to see him in politics regardless of whether he stays in the Senate after this term.
And like we're saying, Tim Scott has won that race right now. We're following the Associated Press. They are calling our races tonight. Of course, that happened right there at 7:01 p.m. The votes are still coming in, but we know overall that that's how that race is going. He defeated Berkeley Democratic State Representative Crystal Matthews. She won that nomination in a runoff by about 5,000 votes following a 3-way June primary and then a runoff. And since then, her campaign has kind of been ensnared with a lot of controversy. We saw that right-wing political activist group, Project Veritas, really kind of get into a lot of nitty-gritty details in her campaign. And she's also running for re-election in the State House District 117, so possibly also going to be unseated there too. So a lot of factors at play down there in her district. But when we talk about the money in this race too, Kirk, it's incredible to talk about just how much was raised, because Tim Scott, one of the top fundraisers in the Senate, had a war chest about $51 million since 2017. I mean, he didn't even use all of it. He had $21 million on hand as of October 19th.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, and I would say for Tim Scott's challenger, for Matthews, it's just hard for Democrats to win a statewide race in South Carolina. I mean, the last time we saw that was 16 years ago. And so it's an uphill battle for a Democratic candidate to begin with. And like you said, once Matthews got through that primary, which was an incredibly difficult primary for her to win, her campaign just never got on track. She had a series of mistakes. You mentioned the Project Veritas video, and she just couldn't recover from those. And she also just didn't have a message that was coherent, that was concise, that was easy for voters to tap into and get them energized and excited about her campaign. And that's all that Tim Scott is about. He is really, really good at connecting with voters and keeping them enthusiastic.
Now, she only raised about $136,000, but you look at Jamie Harrison, raised $130 million to try and unseat Lindsey Graham, got within 10 points of him in 2020. So,
yeah, and that was a record, right? He raised a record amount of money thinking that he might unseat Lindsey Graham. And at the end of the day, it was a 10-point lead that he just couldn't overcome.
Be watching leads tonight coming into. But let's head over to the McMaster and Evatt headquarters in Columbia and talk with Thelisha Eaddy. Thelisha, how's it going over there? I know it's probably a little bit loud for our listeners and viewers, but tell us what it's like on the ground in Columbia.
Yeah, hi, good evening, Gavin. I'm over here at the University of South Carolina Alumni Center in downtown Columbia, and that's where members of the Republican Party are going to gather tonight to hopefully celebrate victories in statewide and local elections on this night. As you can see behind me, we have some people already gathered here. They are dressed to their finest. They are sitting, they're enjoying, and they're talking. And you mentioned earlier about the 16 years that it's been since a Democrat has been elected to statewide offices here. I think that statistic is resonating with folks here. They are expecting victories, and they are excited. They're ready to have a good party as they celebrate their candidates winning elections tonight. Back to you, Gavin.
Great, thank you, Thelisha. I think I saw Attorney General Alan Wilson in the background there. I'm sure we'll be talking to him and some other folks soon. But going back to Tim Scott, Kirk, Tim Scott was in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was picked by Nikki Haley in 2013. To that position to replace outgoing Senator Jim DeMint, and that really put him on that trajectory to where he is right now.
Yeah, and I think that was a brilliant move by Nikki Haley to tap Tim Scott for that office. I mean, he's the first African-American Republican senator from the state of South Carolina, and that in and of itself was a great story, but that, again, combined with his personality, his appeal, just makes him a very charismatic figure. And I think that kind of put him on the path to really decide how far he wants to go in terms of national office.
That's true. He gets to pretty much decide his own fate, which is pretty rare in politics, too.
Exactly.
But, we're talking about Tim Scott being declared the winner of the U.S. Senate race in South Carolina. Easy call at 7:01 p.m. But now we're going to go over to the Cunningham-Casey campaign headquarters with South Carolina Public Radio's Victoria Hansen. And again, it's pretty loud there, folks. I hope you can hear me, Victoria. Tell us what it's like out there.
Hey, Gavin, I hope you can hear me because I cannot hear myself. Hello to everybody back in the studio, everybody watching on television, of course, those listening to us live on South Carolina Public Radio tonight. Yes, I am at the American Theater here in downtown Charleston on King Street. It's an historic theater where former Congressman Joe Cunningham, wants to keep Henry McMaster from becoming the longest-serving governor in our state's history. There is a DJ here. It is a very, very young crowd. If the governor's leading right now, well, you wouldn't know it by the people watching here as some of the results come in across the country. You know, Cunningham has campaigned very hard in what he's called his Vote for Freedom campaign, basically saying that a vote for him is a vote for freedom, a vote for women to have the right to choose what they do with their bodies, a vote in favor of legalizing marijuana and sports betting. The crowd is just getting started here. I don't know where the results are going to go. That's for you guys back in the studio, but I will be here throughout the night. Back to you, Gavin.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. We'll definitely talk more about the gubernatorial campaign in a moment, but I really want to stick with the Tim Scott victory right now because that's the top news that we have to talk about. And, you know, we've been talking about him winning again. This is his second and final full term that he says, so 6 years ahead of him. He's 57 years old. The world is basically his oyster at this point, Kirk. A lot of chatter about 2024. He spent more time campaigning in other states for other folks than he was in his own state because he didn't need to.
Right. And he's done those visits to other states like a presidential candidate would. So he was out in Iowa and talking to people on the ground there. He's hit some of the battleground states. And so he is really laying the groundwork for a possible presidential run. And again, whether it's in 24 or possibly 28, I think that's really the question on everyone's mind. And Tim Scott has done a great job of not sort of revealing those cards. I mean, obviously he wanted to get through this election, which he did very, very easily. And as you said, he had to spend little money in order to do this. So he's sitting on an incredible war chest that he can use in a variety of ways, either for his own future campaigns or perhaps more importantly, to help out other candidates over the next couple of years that might cement his position for when he decides to run for the White House.
Definitely, and that's what we've been seeing him doing with his super PAC. He's been giving money to the Senate Leadership Fund, $17 million to candidates, $5 million to that leadership fund like we're talking about. He had his chief of staff move to a different consulting firm now consulting for that PAC, which is consulting him. So there's a lot of cards lining up here. He had that book come out. There's a lot of buzz. So again, 6 years to decide what he wants to do. 2024 is right here, right now. A lot of candidates are going to have to answer that question. You know, what now? They were always all in on these midterms. Now it's going to be like, well, what's the move for 2024? And obviously there's a big announcement coming next week by former President Donald Trump that everyone's holding their breath on too. Yeah,
I think what'll be interesting to see for Tim Scott is within the Senate over the next 4 to 6 years, how engaged does he get in major pieces of legislation? So we saw him start working on the police reform bill. He partnered with Senator Cory Booker on that. That didn't really go anywhere, but that was one of the first times when he kind of stepped out in the spotlight on a legislative side. And I think if he does more of that, that will just sort of further cement his position. If he sits back and just tries to sort of campaign over the next 6 years, I'm not entirely sure if that puts him in a better position or not. So if nothing else, Tim Scott has been very savvy in how he's used his time and been very strategic about where he puts his resources. And I think if he continues that same pattern, again, he will go a long way towards cementing a position as a very tough candidate for the presidency. And if not presidency in 2026, there's a wide open governor's race in South Carolina. So always something we could look forward to. But we got some numbers for folks to look at right now to talk about. We're talking with Kirk Randazza from USC on set right here. But these are the latest numbers we have for U.S. Senate. We already know that Tim Scott has been declared the winner by the Associated Press. But the latest numbers show that he has 59% of the vote to State Representative Crystal Matthews at 41%, with 5% of the votes being counted at this time. When we look at the governor's race, we have Governor Henry McMaster and Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evette at 55.8%, and then Joe Cunningham and Tally Casey at 43%. That's a number we'll be watching all night. That's an 8% margin right there, but with only 5% of the votes being counted. So we're going to be watching that, how close that gets apparently throughout the night. That's what we're going to be keeping a close eye on. And when we look at the first congressional district down there in the Charleston area, Annie Andrews with an early lead over Nancy Mace. These are early numbers. We don't even have a percent of votes counted at this point, so it's just a lot of absentee votes, I'm assuming, and some early voting numbers. So it's 58.86, and then I think that was 41% there for Nancy Mace, who's looking for her second term. We can start talking about the first congressional district. That will be one of our more competitive districts. Obviously, we already had some winners in the upstate, and I'm assuming all of our congressional districts will go the way that they're supposed to go. We're waiting for AP race calls there too. But Kirk, when we look at the first congressional district, we just saw redistricting happen this year. There's a lawsuit going on with that. It's in the courts, but we're still operating under that new map, which made the first more Republican because it was getting a little purple there, becoming a little bit more of a swing district in our state. Yeah, and in fact, Joe Cunningham had that seat a few years ago and lost it to Nancy Mace. But Nancy Mace herself went through a really difficult primary, and I guess it's not surprising to see the early numbers come in like this, but I think that will absolutely work its way out, and Mace will ultimately get reelected. If she didn't, that would be a surprise upset, in my opinion.
For sure, and I think that's definitely going to be the case in terms of Nancy Mace getting reelected there too. We'll be watching that, but a lot more to talk about that race in the first congressional district. But I want to jump to a special guest, Maayan Schechter. She's the politics editor at the state newspaper. She's taken time out of a very busy night for all reporters in the state and across the country to talk to us. Maayan, thanks for making time. Let's talk to you about the state house races. There are a lot of unopposed races. Obviously, primary night in June was a little bit more of a spicy time for these races. But what are you seeing right now when it comes to state house races and what's happening there?
Right. So we're still waiting on votes to really trickle in. I did just look at the State Election Commission's voting website, and some of the races we're already starting to see votes, but a lot of the big races that we're watching for, I haven't seen votes on those yet. Of course, you mentioned Crystal Matthews' Senate race against Tim Scott, who won his reelection. You mentioned that she is in a tough state house race. We're still watching that as she opposes her Republican challenger, Jordan Pace. We're also watching a Richland County swing district house race here between incumbent Republican and his Democratic challenger Heather Bauer. There's another race in the Low Country between Chardell Murray and her Republican opponent, Matthew Lieber. And then there are a collective other races that we will be watching for, especially those in districts where Democrats represent some of the more rural areas of the state, areas that we saw in past state house elections flip to Republicans. So we will be watching those as well.
Gotcha, Mayan. And we're not too, I mean, there's not going to be some big surprise here where the chamber flips, obviously, because it's already solidly a Republican. Democrats will probably lose several seats there, giving the Republicans probably a supermajority as expected. There's 124 members in that chamber right now, 80 Republicans, 43 Democrats, and 1 vacancy. So the power dynamics at play there. When you also look at the new leadership in that chamber, too, will be making for a very interesting January when we start back up in Columbia.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to put it. As you mentioned, 83 for a supermajority, but most will argue that Republicans have been controlling the chamber for years, and they've therefore been controlling the legislative priorities. So supermajority or not, it really doesn't make a huge difference. And yes, like you mentioned, interesting leadership changes that have happened over the past year. We saw Speaker Jay Lucas step down, elevating former House Budget Chairman Merle Smith to Speaker. Davey Hyatt became the House Majority Leader. We're now going to have a brand new budget chairman, along with potential other new committee chairwoman as well. After Rita Allison lost her House race in the primary, she of course chaired the House Education and Public Works Committee. So yes, I think the House is going to be in for some really interesting times. You and I were just talking about earlier. There were a collective 20 or so Republicans and Democrats who either didn't seek re-election, who lost in their primary, or who were redistricted out. So you take that number, you add in the new faces that are coming in. It's definitely a brand new South Carolina House.
We're going to have to learn some new names come January, Mayan. But really quick before we let you go, because I know you're very busy right now, tell us a little bit about the abortion debate going on right now. We've been watching that happen throughout the off season, in the summertime, through the fall. We're going to see a special session tomorrow in the Senate. Can you kind of give our viewers who are maybe tuning in, maybe paying attention for the first time, giving them a little idea about what's going to happen there in the Senate tomorrow when it comes to this abortion bill?
Right. So legislators so kindly decided to schedule a 10 a.m. conference committee between House and Senate negotiators over H 5399, which is the abortion bill that neither side can really come to a compromise. As far as we know, there is still no compromise of how restrictive this bill should be. At a previous conference committee hearing last week, neither side could agree on just how restrictive a bill could be. There were 2 proposals that came up, both which banned abortions at conception, which Senate Majority Leader Shane Massey has said repeatedly over and over again, that kind of ban does not have the votes in the state Senate. So the conference committee will come back tomorrow. We'll see whether they actually can approve a report. If they do approve a report, as you mentioned, the Senate has scheduled an 11 o'clock special session to come back and take up the bill. Now, the big if is what they do with that bill. If there is a report that comes out of the conference committee, the House has scheduled a Thursday return, but only if the conference committee is able to get a report out, and only if the Senate is able to actually pass a report out. So it still is to be determined exactly what's going to happen tomorrow morning, but we'll be there.
Yeah. Not holding our breath too much, just on what we've been talking about and hearing from folks. So, Mayan Schechter with the State Newspaper, thank you so much. We'll be checking with you again shortly. But Kirk, just talking about that too, abortion obviously being a top issue over the summer with the Dobbs decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in June, overturning about 50 years of abortion access precedent. How did you see that factoring into this election, and where did it finally end up, I guess?
Well, I think that was a huge factor for this election, because typically in a midterm election, whichever party occupies the White House, that party loses a lot of seats in Congress. And that, I think, was the track that we were headed on, because inflation was high, the economy wasn't that good, so all of the numbers were pointing in favor of the Republican Party to make large gains in both the House and the Senate. And now the Supreme Court steps in June, overturns Roe v. Wade, and this is the first time in the history of the United States that a constitutional right has been withdrawn from the population. And that galvanized a whole lot of people on the left, and that was momentum that the Democratic Party was hoping to carry into November, into tonight. And early on, it looked like they were going to be pretty successful. And then that momentum kind of died out a little bit. But what that's done is galvanize state legislatures to think about redrawing their legislation. And you just heard the report about the State House coming back potentially for a special session to vote on a bill simply because of the fact that that members of the legislature are trying to get to a point where abortions are banned outright. And previous attempts have either failed in the courts or have failed in the legislature. And that, I think, is a complication that folks are trying to work through right now to get a bill that is acceptable to a majority of both the Senate and the House. And that's been a very hard thing for them to do.
And there's always January, as they say, too. They'll come back and they'll take it back up if they don't pass it tomorrow, which is not likely. But right now, we're going to go to Thelisha Eaddy, who's at the McMaster-Evatt campaign headquarters, and she's joined by SCGOP Chairman Drew McKissick. Hey, Thelisha.
Hi, Gavin, good evening. I'm here with Chairman of the Republican Party, Mr. Drew McKissick. Thank you so much for your time. How excited are you tonight?
Very excited. We're going to have a fantastic night from one end of the state to the other. Our voters are enthused. They're turning out in record numbers for midterm election, and we're going to have people win tonight that are going to surprise people before it's over.
We just heard from Representative Joe Wilson. He took to the stage a little while ago with family and supporters, winning re-election again. I remember talking with you right before your convention in Charlotte a few years ago, and we talked about how the Republican Party, its members, know your platform and know your issues, and they stick to it, and that's what's been propelling you to victories in this state. Apply that to what we may see or will see tonight.
Well, you know, I've always said issues win campaigns. I mean, people get excited and motivated about issues. And that'll vary from election cycle to election cycle. I mean, this cycle, the economy's big, inflation's big, crime has been big, especially in other states around the country. Immigration's been a big issue. You know, here in South Carolina, the governor's race, economic development's been a big issue. You know, the governor's been making great strides on that, and I think voters are rewarding him because of that. And, you know, so people who get enthusiastic about issues and then the candidates who represent those issues work. Excited people work. I mean, instead of just voting for your candidate, they're working for your candidate. They're getting other people to vote for your candidate. So having the right message that's relevant to people on a daily basis, relevant to their daily lives, is critical.
You know, as we talk about South Carolina growing population-wise, and we see the numbers when we have registered voters, sometimes we often think about, you know, do values change as the state grows? Does that fit within the Republican Party? Is there any thoughts or talk about changing messaging, or is what's working?
Well, no. I mean, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, look, we have been winning races all around the state at an increasing rate with our traditional conservative message. And that's what's led to our growth in places like Chesterfield County, Dillon County, Jasper County, places where, you know, you haven't seen Republicans win in over 140 years, where we have candidates who will be winning tonight. That tells me you don't change strategy when things are going in your direction.
Chairman Drew McKissick, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Happy to.
All right. Gavin, back to you.
Thanks, Thelisha, and thanks to Drew. We're going to jump to Victoria Hansen really quickly. She's at the Cunningham-Casey campaign headquarters in Charleston. Go ahead, Victoria. Tell us what's going on down there.
Audio for a bit. Can you fill me in on what the latest numbers are in this governor's race real quick, Gavin?
I can once I look them up on this computer right here.
58%. Cunningham at 40%.
There you go. McMaster at 58% and Cunningham at 41% there, Victoria. So about a 16-point lead there for McMaster right now with 0 counties fully reporting.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot that way. Again, I lost audio for a bit, but I am back now. I'm here at the American Theater in downtown Charleston on King Street. I get a DJ going, a very, very young crowd. You know, Joe Cunningham has been very busy campaigning over the last couple of weeks, especially going to a lot of colleges, talking to young people on this Vote for Freedom campaign. Again, as I told you a little bit earlier, he says that a vote for him is a vote for freedom, a vote for rights, a vote moving, he says, in the right direction. He calls the governor a relic of the past and says it's time to move on. I'll be interested to see, and I haven't been able to hear you guys talk much about this, but about the early voting numbers. I know they were quite high here in Charleston County. I'm curious to see how those could bode for former Congressman Joe Cunningham in this race. He's been very popular here, but I guess this is the first time really that his popularity is being tested statewide against such a strong Republican candidate such as Governor McMaster. But again, if the governor's ahead right now, the folks here simply do not know it. They've been watching results come in from across the country, applauding at different times as Democrats seem to be in the lead. So again, I am live here at the American Theater in downtown Charleston. I'm going to send it back to you guys there in the studio.
Thanks, Victoria. Tell them to put ETV on. They'll know what's going on because we're about to give you some statewide numbers right now. We're going to look at the congressional races, I'm told. And we're looking there at the U.S. House District 1 race. That's the most competitive race that we're going to be watching tonight with Dr. Annie Andrews at 58.6% and Nancy Mace, the incumbent, looking for her second term at 41%. Again, 0% of the votes being counted here. These are just early numbers. That number will change, more than likely flip soon. And we're going to continue to look at these other numbers. Joe Wilson, we just were talking about, has been, I guess he's leading right there too at 56% to Judd Larkins, the Democrat in that race at 43%. And we're going to look at some other numbers there as well. Continue on looking at Joe Wilson. And I want to talk about Joe Wilson because we were just hearing from Drew McKissick, the SCGOP chairman. Joe Wilson, first elected in 2001. He was going for his 11th term tonight. He's going to win that 11th term, defeating business owner Judd Larkins, a Democrat. Wilson's 75. He first won a special election in 2001. And it's just been we're just talking about 11 terms here. We're talking about long-serving representatives. We're going to look at Jeff Duncan. He won a 7th term tonight, too, up in the 3rd Congressional District. William Timmons, he's up in the 4th Congressional District, a 3rd term. So, again, not too surprising here, Kirk. A lot of folks just kind of, I don't want to say on autopilot, but they're out there touching the bases. They're doing their things, but getting easily reelected with no challenge.
Yeah, there's really no surprise in any of that. And you look at someone like Joe Wilson, I think one of his strengths, similar to Tim Scott, is that he's an everyday person that relates to everyday people. Mm-hmm. And you can sit down and talk to Joe Wilson like we're talking right now, and it can be a very comfortable conversation. He also does a phenomenal job of providing constituent service. Yes. And so he has come to virtually anybody's assistance, whether they're Democrat or Republican. Mm-hmm. And that's stuff that people remember. And I think Joe Wilson has done a remarkable job of just keeping himself out there in front of people so that they remember who he is, and then they'll cast a vote for him when it comes time for the election.
Yeah, if you don't have a business card or a keychain from Joe Wilson, then you've never met the man.
Exactly. You know? Yeah, he hands those things out like candy.
Yeah, and he's also on the House Armed Services Committee, too, which is huge for South Carolina. Another congressman, too, that we haven't talked about, surprised they haven't declared this as a winner yet, but Congressman Jim Clyburn, he is going for his 16th term tonight. Again, another long-serving South Carolina representative there in Congress.
Yeah, and Jim Clyburn is one of the pillars of South Carolina. And again, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter. He has been in the House for so long that he is just part of that institutional history. Mm-hmm. And he as a history teacher, he loves to talk about, stories of how the state and the country have progressed over the years. And I think that has kept him very, very centered and kept the public just enthralled with everything that Jim Clyburn does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he recently made some controversial comments to some folks, but he's just very worried about where democracy is heading, especially in some of these other states where there are election deniers who are on the ticket, who are in charge, who could soon be in charge of some of these elections, other folks who support them. Kirk, what's your read on some of these states where that's the case? The future of democracy, in your opinion, how dire is it with this election? Is it just typical, the sky is falling, or is this the real deal in Clyburn's opinion?
So I will say a couple things about Clyburn and then talk about the democracy part. One, Clyburn has no problem sort of throwing elbows against people of his own party, let alone people of the Republican Party. And so, for example, when the progressive caucus in the Democratic Party wanted to change how police departments were funded, and that got labeled defund the police, Clyburn came out against them and said that is absolutely the wrong message to send. And the moderate majority of America absolutely agreed with Clyburn. Now he's talking about democracy, and I think there's a lot a lot of the points that he is raising are things that people should sit up and take notice about. I mean, for the first time ever, we did not have a peaceful transfer of power from one presidency to another. That is a big deal. And the fact that 300 candidates in the Republican Party are campaigning openly that Joe Biden was not legitimately elected president, that's a very scary thing. And as a political scientist that studies how democracies can fall to authoritarianism, this is exactly how it's done. And we've seen this in other countries around the world. And to think that the United States is even remotely on that path and potentially squarely on that path really is a cause for concern.
Eye-opening stuff right there that we've been talking about, we're going to continue to talk about because democracy is always on the ballot when it's election day. We're going to jump right now to Thelisha Eaddy. She's joined by Attorney General Alan Wilson, who's about to win his fourth term, probably did because he has no opposition. So easy win right there. He did have a primary opponent who he easily defeated. But we're going to jump to Thelisha Eaddy, who's with our top chief prosecutor in the state, Alan Wilson.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations. We saw your father just a little while ago on stage, family members and supporters as well. I wanted to ask you, when you think about what you've accomplished here as Attorney General here in South Carolina, running unopposed fourth term, and then thinking about the future, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, first off, I work with some of the most amazing men and women in South Carolina government. I mean, running the state's chief prosecution agency is a dream come true for me, and to be able to do it for a fourth term is just, I'm so grateful for the people of South Carolina for allowing me to serve. Some of the things I'm really proud of is what we've done in evolving with technology. Obviously, the growth of the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. When I was Attorney General, there were only about, when I was first elected rather, there were only like 40 law enforcement agencies. Now we have over 115. The growth of the Human Trafficking Task Force. It's sad that we have to have these task force, but the fact that people are, their public awareness is being raised and we're investing into these types of task force to go out there and protect South Carolina families is something I'm really proud of.
What are some of your goals to help move South Carolina forward during your next term?
Honestly, we want to go out there and do our best to protect the rights of parents and how they see their children being educated. We want to protect South Carolina as a state from what's going on in Washington, D.C. and around the country. We want communities to feel safe and that their local officials are holding a public trust for them and not abusing that trust. So we're going to be looking at, some public corruption initiatives. We're going to look at initiatives to promote transparency in government. And we're also going to be looking at promoting parental rights in our Constitution, making sure that parents have the final line of say in how their children are educated.
There's one initiative that comes out of your office that it gets a lot of attention, and it draws attention to an issue that a lot of people are calling a public health issue, and that's the silent witness program. Can you talk a little bit about that and how your office is working to help improve the numbers?
Well, thank you for talking about that. That is something we do every October, where we recognize and remember men and women who were killed in a relationship with a domestic partner. And of course, sadly, South Carolina was ranked 23rd in the country, but a couple of years ago we were number 1 in the country. So while we're still in the top half, we have gone in the right direction in educating the public and letting men and women know who are in abusive relationships. Sadly, it's mostly women who lose their lives in these relationships, but letting them know that they are not alone, raising awareness about it, and then giving them access to victim service providers and nonprofit groups and church faith-based groups that can help them get out of that cycle of abuse when they don't feel like they can. You're not trapped, you're not alone, we're here to help you. So raising public awareness and providing support is something that we're really proud of, and we kind of commemorate that every October with the Silent Witness program at the State House.
Attorney General Alan Wilson, again, congratulations. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Thelisha. Appreciate it. Yes, ma'am.
Back to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Thelisha. She was there with Attorney General Alan Wilson, who just won his 4th term officially, again, unopposed there. And we got some new numbers now in the governor's race. Governor Henry McMaster, the Republican, with his running mate, Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evette, is right now at 57% of the vote, with former 1st Congressional District Congressman Joe Cunningham and Tally Casey at 41%. Looks like 42% right there. So we're going to keep watching those numbers as they fluctuate. That's a big race we're watching, but those numbers are pretty much where the race is going, as everyone's thinking. But I want to talk more about these statewide constitutional officers. We just heard from Attorney General Alan Wilson. We got some other officers that won statewide. You might have saw them on your ballot, including Secretary of State Mark Hammond. He was reelected to a 6th term as Secretary of State, which in our state does not oversee the elections.
Right.
We have a state election commission for folks who are maybe new to our state or maybe haven't paid attention too much to what we do here. The state election commission oversees our elections, whereas the Secretary of State deals with business filings, charity filings, and plays a role in the lawmaking process of a bill. The biggest race we saw in that was in 2014 for Hammond, but he's easily survived many terms, like we said, his 6th term. We also have Commissioner of Agriculture Hugh Weathers. That will be a race. Hugh Weathers is going to win, obviously, because he only has 3 third-party candidates who we don't expect to put up too much of a fight there, especially no Democrats on that ballot either. This will be his 6th and final term as Commissioner of Agriculture, representing some 25,000 farms in the state. You probably know his name because he's in all the gas pumps across the state as well. 64,000 gas pumps, that is. He's not responsible for the gas price, so he makes that very clear. And then, of course, Comptroller General Richard Ekstrom. He's going to win his 6th term as the state's top accountant. He's the self-proclaimed champion of fiscal restraint, accountability, and transparency in all government. And Treasurer Curtis Loftus, he'll win his 4th term as state treasurer as well. So again, Kirk, going back to this discussion about statewide offices, Republicans, one of the big statewide races we're going to be watching is the superintendent of education race between Republican Ellen Weaver, Democrat Lisa Ellis. They're looking to replace outgoing superintendent of education Molly Spearman. She's been there. She's been a Republican for the past 2 terms. Big race there. Have you been watching it? Kind of what have you deduced from that race and what we're going to be watching for tonight?
Yeah, so that's really the one race that I think everybody is looking at, because you have it's been a controversy from the start, even in the primary season when Ellen Weaver beat Kathy Manis in the primary. There was a concern that Weaver didn't meet the necessary qualifications. She didn't have the graduate degree in education. And those concerns haven't really gone away. Weaver's campaign has said she has completed the coursework at Bob Jones University, but Bob Jones won't comment on that. And it's been, there's still been a lot of question marks. Lisa Ellis, in contrast, has been a teacher her entire career and has really sort of championed teachers. She founded an organization that would champion for teachers' rights. And so you have those two that are kind of battling each other. And that's probably going to take a little while to call, although, again, since it's difficult for Democrats to win statewide races, I think Weaver has the advantage going into tonight. She's got the lead right now, and I don't really anticipate that that's going to change at all, but we'll see as the votes continue to come in. But the other statewide races, those all fell exactly as people expected. Yeah, we're talking about that qualification that Ellen Weaver got because that was something that was added to the state law. They were trying to get the superintendent of education to be appointed by the governor. That did not pass, so now they're still running on the ballot like they do. But at this time, we also saw folks in that Republican primary drop out, too, because they didn't meet that qualification, didn't read the instructions before the test. Ellen saw that. She said, I'm going to get this done. She got it done in 6 months when it would typically take 12 to 18 months. I mean, you've gone through graduate work. You oversee folks in this line of work. I mean, is it typical to be able to get a graduate degree in 6 months? No. And not only is it not typical to complete the coursework, sort of the spirit of the law is to have an educator serve as superintendent of education. And that requires being in the classroom. It requires seeing students and working with students and helping them learn and progress. And Weaver just doesn't have that in her background. And so the argument that she completed her coursework, even if that's true by the letter of the law, I still think the spirit of the law, there's some difficulties there, and that's what a lot of people have been raising concerns about.
And in her defense, she does say she has a policy background too, which in management for what you need for this job. But we're going to go right now to Victoria Hansen down there in Charleston, because Dr. Annie Andrews is speaking. She's the 1st Congressional District Democratic nominee.
Hi, Gavin. Yes, I have with me right now Dr. Annie Andrews. Again, it's very difficult for us to hear. I hope she can hear my questions. Thank you so much for joining me. I know the numbers are just now coming in, but how are you feeling about tonight?
I feel incredibly hopeful. We had a great day out at the polls today. There's a lot of energy out there. I talked to a lot of independent, moderate Republican women who voted blue for the first time. So I think we have a real shot for a victory tonight.
And why did you run? I mean, it's really tough in politics these days.
It is, but over a decade of working at the Children's Hospital, plus being a mom to my own 3 children, I know we need leaders who will step up and fight for what our children need. Address climate change, restore women's reproductive freedom, address gun violence, and protect our democracy. We just need more problem solvers in Washington, people who are willing to roll up their sleeves, solve problems rather than play partisan politics.
How big is abortion as an issue in this race?
I think it's the #1 issue in this district specifically that has so many suburbs, a lot of suburban families who want what's best for their daughters. They can't believe that half of us have had our rights taken away, rights that we had for 50 years. So I know for a fact that it moved a lot of independent women over to the Democratic side for this election cycle.
And as you run for the first time, what do you hope that you're accomplishing?
I know that I'm inspiring my kids, and I know that I'm inspiring healthcare professionals all across the country to step up and get more involved in politics. And I just hope that I am, win or lose, creating positive change in my community, because we certainly could use more of that.
Dr. Andrews, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck tonight, and I hope to check back with you later.
Thank you so much.
All right, again, that was Dr. Annie Andrews joining us tonight live here at the American Theater on King Street in downtown Charleston, where there's a watch party of sorts. You can tell a very crowded place, very young crowd, lots of music, lots of excitement, and we will be here throughout the night. Back to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Victoria. And let's look at those results right now for that 1st Congressional District race. We're talking about Annie Andrews there at 58.1% and incumbent Nancy Mace at 41.4%. Again, those numbers, it's about no percentage of the votes counted right now, so still very early. We expect that to be a very tight race, very Republican area that we did see Nancy Mace take back in 2020 from Joe Cunningham, like we talked about. Talk about Nancy Mace a little bit here, Kirk. We're talking about, her winning that seat back. She a couple days into office, after being sworn in as a freshman lawmaker, 2021, January 6th happens. She's rattled by it like a lot of folks are, like a lot of Americans, frankly. She was there. She took right to the airwaves. I remember talking to her moments after that, too, a couple days. Did a lot of talking, being very critical of Donald Trump, who she supported, but not going far like Tom Rice in the 7th Congressional District to impeach him, because she saw that future, and we saw the fate of Tom Rice in the 7th Congressional District primary. Can you talk about that and that ability to walk that line?
Yeah, and I think that was a really smart, strategic move on the part of Nancy Mace, in that she got her message out that distanced herself from Donald Trump, but did not cast that vote. So like Rice did, that was something that Trump could then fixate on, and ultimately that led to Congressman Rice's demise in the House. But at the same time, Mace, in trying to walk that fine line, drew the anger of Donald Trump, and that was one of the reasons that she had a difficult primary. But she was able to overcome that, I think, with a very smart campaign, a message that voters could tap into and identify with, and that allowed her to sustain that primary challenge and take her into the general election. Now, it'll be curious to see how she fares tonight. Right now, she's losing, But like you said, we only have about 0.5% of the precincts reporting yet, so it's still very early to make any predictions, though I do think she will likely retain that seat.
So Kirk, yeah, kind of going back to what we're talking about, you know, that district 2018, Joe Cunningham beat Katie Arrington. Katie Arrington had just upset Mark Sanford in that primary. It was shocking. You know, Mark Sanford still had $1 million left in the bank, left on the field. Then Katie Arrington versus Joe Cunningham. Joe Cunningham flips that district for the first time in some 40 years, 2018. He was part of one of, I think, 31 Democrats nationwide that flipped Trump-won districts because he had won that district, the first congressional district, in 2016, lost it in 2020 to Nancy Mace, and then Nancy Mace has to fight Katie Arrington again in that primary fight. She was backed by Donald Trump, but then Nancy Mace pulls it out by about 6,000 votes. So what does that say about this district, that it's not that far right, it's not that far left? I mean, it's really just right if you're looking at a moderate type scale, I guess.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways what it says is that is sort of the ideal district from a voter's perspective, in that you want something that gives a legitimate choice so that the candidates are forced to debate ideas and proposals and visions and not have a relatively safe district where a candidate really doesn't have to run on anything because they know they can put their campaign into autopilot and still get elected. Mm-hmm. So having a competitive district like that, I actually think is ideal. And again, from a political scientist perspective, I would love to see all districts be like that so that you have campaigns based on ideas and less about personalities. Mm-hmm. But that also means for the candidates that you have to be able to dig down, create a campaign that has a good message, that articulates a vision that voters can tap into and agree with. And I think Nancy Mace has done a good job of doing exactly that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then we should also add, too, since they did redistrict that district as well as all the other ones in the state this past year, dealing with just what's going on and making that district more red, too, make it safer.
Yeah, it should make things a little bit more comfortable for her this time around. Mm-hmm. Again, the numbers aren't bearing that out at the moment. Yeah. But I think she should still feel very optimistic about her chances.
Mm-hmm. And then, you know, we talk about growth in the state. We talk about census numbers with the state just booming. You go up the coast, Georgetown, Horry County, inland to the PD. That's the 7th Congressional District, where we're talking about Russell Fry winning that primary outright. I think there were 7 people in that primary, including Tom Rice, who was going for her 6th term, got knocked out straight up in the primary by Russell Fry, state representative. That was a huge race, a huge primary. Again, all these big races are decided during our primaries because that's when they're the most competitive.
Yeah, and especially in a state like South Carolina that is so dominated by the Republican Party, the action is pretty much all going to be in the primaries. And that's actually something that these hotly contested primaries are relatively recent phenomena as well, because the parties tend to protect their own. They tend to protect the incumbents, and we're not seeing that anymore. Certainly not in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party as well. We've seen some hotly contested Democratic primaries, and it's curious to see if that's a longer-term trend where we will see more contested primaries than we have in the past. I think we still need a few more data points, a few more election cycles to play out to see that. But it looks like the primaries are becoming more intense, which brings up several questions because voters tend not to look at primaries as closely as they do the general election. Mm-hmm. And that might be something that voters will have to take into account in the future.
Yeah, we should note that Russell Fry, State Representative Russell Fry, he's been in the State House since 2015. He won that primary. He's from Surfside Beach. He's 37 years old. He has a Democrat that he's being challenged by tonight. That's Darrell Scott. He's an Army veteran. But again, like we're saying, we expect Russell Fry to win that race. We haven't had it called yet, but that's the expectation since it's a solidly red district in the 7th there. And we have some new congressional district numbers for you here right now. We're still looking at the first congressional district where Annie Andrews is still leading Nancy Mace. Again, these are early numbers. We don't expect that lead to hold. In fact, it will soon flip, I'm sure, once we get some new numbers out of the Charleston Low Country area. Going to the second congressional district with Joe Wilson, we have 15% of the votes counted, and Joe Wilson comfortably at 61%. We already, I believe, called this race for Joe Wilson. The AP did, again, in the second congressional district there. And Ralph Norman at 61% in House District 5, 41% of the votes counted. Again, an easy victory for Ralph Norman in the 5th Congressional District as a Republican. And we were just talking about the 7th Congressional District there, and you see Russell Fry with 61% of the vote and Darrell Scott at 39%, and that's with 32% of the votes being counted in the 7th Congressional District. I think those are the numbers we got right now. Let's stick with the 7th Congressional District, too. We did see President Donald Trump campaigning not just for Katie Arrington, like we were talking about in the 1st Congressional District in March, but also Russell Fry was there as well, because he had 7 folks he had to get through in that primary. Again, won it outright with 51% of the vote. But it'll be interesting to see, because we're going to talk about what's going on with this new House in the U.S. House of Representatives in D.C., expected to get that majority. What's Russell Fry going to have to do to make sure he doesn't have to deal with a primary? We're talking about primary challenges. Is he going to have to get in there and really just lay down the law and show his true colors and make sure that no one comes from his right?
You know, I think that's an excellent question, and no one knows at this point in time. And I think part of the reason is that Kevin McCarthy, if he becomes Speaker of the House, he's not really indicated in concrete terms exactly what he'll do, but he has hinted at things like he will give Marjorie Taylor Greene, representative from Georgia, a more prominent role. Right now, she's been removed of all committee assignments. He's going to put her on committees, and potentially some very important committees. She is a very polarizing kind of figure. And so the question then becomes, if she is going to have a prominent place in Kevin McCarthy's leadership, is that a pattern that other representatives like Fry or any other Republicans will have to copy in order to get their name known? And if that's the case, if that's true, then I think it potentially pushes the representatives in the Republican Party out to a farther extreme. And it's almost like a race to the bottom now to see, who can make the most audacious kind of comment in order to snag media attention and get those headlines, because that's what Kevin McCarthy will pay attention to. I'm not sure that's the path that we're on. I hope that's not. But again, McCarthy hasn't really sent clear signals about how he would govern, other than to say, there's going to be a lot of investigations of President Biden and his administration, and folks like Greene will have a prominent role in those investigations.
And when we talk about, actually doing something versus just talking about something or making noise or headlines, that was a big argument, too, in the 7th Congressional primary race, where you had Tom Rice, who's been on the Budget Committee for a while there, was moving his way up. Traditionally, that would carry some weight. That'd be a good thing for South Carolina. This guy can get money sent back to the state, especially if you're against earmarks. Hey, let's do it through the committee. But instead, it was fry the rice. That was Russell Fry's slogan right there. And, he got the back end Donald Trump. He got that momentum and won at 51% versus Rice getting 25% in that primary. So just really showing what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think it helps demonstrate that it is very easy to campaign against something or someone. It is a whole lot harder to govern and actually get something accomplished. And that was what Rice was trying to run on, was his record of getting things done, getting things accomplished for South Carolina, for the people in his district. But that didn't resonate with voters. It was the campaign. It was fry the rice, which is a hilarious slogan.
Sure.
But it doesn't say what Fry would do if he is in that position. And so governing is immensely more complicated. It is harder to do than the campaigning. And if the Republicans take control, like I expect, like everybody I think expects will happen, it'll then be curious to see how a Kevin McCarthy House actually governs.
And now, Kirk, we're going to switch from congressional news to statewide news because we have some breaking news now. The Associated Press is calling Governor Henry Dargan McMaster as the winner in the gubernatorial race, setting into his second full term, defeating Democratic challenger Joe Cunningham, the former 1st Congressional District Congressman. Not surprising news here. It's about 8:55. I think the AP called it a few moments ago. This is earlier than when they did in 2018, Kirk. That was at 9:33, so right before the 9 o'clock hour, about less than 2 hours since polls have closed. So big win there for Governor Henry McMaster, the Republican. He's going on to his second term with Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evette. We were on this stage a couple weeks ago. He was right here doing that debate. Interesting times to see that race. I saw him on his bus tour the past couple days. He did 19 stops statewide over 8 days. That's a lot for anybody. We're talking about a 75-year-old, but he was energized on that campaign trail, I can tell you, just seeing folks out and about. What does this mean for the governor? This is a position he's always wanted, and he's now going to have it if he makes it through this final term, which he's expected to, the longest ever.
Again, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. I think McMaster ran a fantastic campaign. He had commercials out there attacking Joe Cunningham that were smart, they were witty, they made people laugh, but more importantly, they made people sit up and think, do I really want someone like Cunningham in the governor's mansion? And I think Cunningham really had difficulty gaining traction among a large segment of voters. You know, we've seen reports from his headquarters now, a lot of young people that were there, and he really spent a lot of time trying to court the younger voters, get them engaged. But the younger voters, first of all, they only make up about 20% of the electorate. These are folks anywhere from 18 to 29. They're only about 20% of the electorate in this state, and typically they have the lowest turnout out of any of the other demographics. You have folks over 45, they represent about 55, 56% of the electorate, and Cunningham didn't really target them. McMaster did, and those are the ones that historically will come out and vote, and especially vote in a gubernatorial election. And so I think McMaster's campaign was just, I think it was more disciplined,
Sure.
I think it was seasoned, and I think it had the right combination of message to appeal to different demographics.
And that's something I saw on the trail too, because I also saw the Cunningham, they were doing a statewide tour as well over the past few days, the final push across the state. And when you went to a McMaster event, it was a well-oiled machine. Of course, just like the Republican Party in the state, where you have the elected officials from that area. You have maybe a U.S. Senator there. You have congressmen there. Easy to do in these places because they are prevalent. But it was just, you have these folks up and down the ballot who were there rah, rah, rah for the governor, which is what you want. You want to show that force. And then, you know, you would go to the Democratic event for Joe Cunningham. You had a great turnout with younger folks, organic turnout there, it seemed like, but also not as many elected officials, which I was a little surprised by. You'd think that you'd have some folks from at least the State House out and about. You had some folks that were running for offices, but at the same time, just a little bit of a different vibe there. Of course, the money race was also interesting too, because he had such an advantage there too. The name ID always helps. But he's been around in politics for a long time too, Governor McMaster.
He has, and before he was governor, he was attorney general, and used that as sort of his launching pad to the lieutenant governor position. And then when Nikki Haley was asked to be ambassador to the United Nations, he got to step in and fill out the rest of her term and then get elected on his own. This is now his re-election, and like you said, if he serves out the full term, he will be the longest serving governor in the history of South Carolina.
Yeah, 10 years. He got his wish from President Donald Trump because he endorsed President Donald Trump. He was one of the first statewide elected officials.
Yep.
And so with that comes, what do you want?
Exactly.
Get Nikki Haley to the United Nations so I can become governor.
Exactly.
A goal of mine since he's been a boy here in South Carolina. But of course, he was also not only just lieutenant governor too, but we saw him in a variety of positions. that have just really got that name ID out there as well for the governor. So let's just go ahead and start at the top of the hour. It's almost 9 o'clock in South Carolina, where the polls have now been closed for 2 hours. And if you're just joining us on SCETV or South Carolina Public Radio, welcome. I'm in studio. I'm Gavin Jackson with Kirk Randazzo of USC. And here are tonight's winners so far. We just got news that Governor Henry McMaster has been declared the winner over Joe Cunningham for his second full term as governor, with Lieutenant Governor Pam Evett. Tim Scott has been declared the winner over Crystal Matthews in the U.S. Senate race, sending him to his second full term too. And so again, let's just get back to that, Kirk, the top news there with McMaster defeating Joe Cunningham there. We saw McMaster, we're talking about his legacy, worked for Strom Thurmond in the Senate, was appointed U.S. Attorney for South Carolina by President Reagan in 81. Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in 86, lost to Fritz Hollings, another long-serving South Carolinian. We have that history of long-serving folks.
Exactly.
They love it. They can't get enough of it. I want some more of it, as the McMaster campaign would say. But he lost a bid for lieutenant governor in 1990. He lost a couple things. Political fortunes changed in 93 when he was then named GOP chairman of the party through 2002. Got to attorney general through 2011, but lost to Nikki Haley in 2010. That was a big upset there in 2010. Changed the fates a little bit too, but he eventually became her lieutenant governor.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that anyone can say about Henry McMaster is that he just doesn't give up.
Yeah.
He perseveres, and he knows that politics is a marathon, not a sprint. And regardless of whether he loses an election, he still positions himself to run for the next election and learns from the mistakes of those previous campaigns and becomes a much stronger candidate the next time around. And he's done that over his entire career.
So, Kirk, then what does that mean for Joe Cunningham's future? We tried to get this out of him on the campaign trail. He said, I'm going to run through the tape. Didn't really give us any indication about what might be next for the former 1st District Congressman. That was a big move in 2018 when he flipped that district. He was trying to replicate that statewide like so many Democrats have tried to do. Didn't work out tonight.
Yeah, I think Joe Cunningham is probably going to do a lot of soul searching over the next several weeks, next few months, because it's uncertain where his career in politics is going to go. It's, as we've said multiple times, it is very difficult for Democrats to win statewide offices in South Carolina. And if that's his ambition, then he's going to have to do a lot more groundwork to better position himself to make a run for the governorship or for some other statewide office, maybe a Senate position. And it's not clear that he has that interest. And it's also not clear that he has the connections in order to do that. That's something that Henry McMaster had. He had connections that he could rely on over an extended period of time to get him into a better position for future runs. I'm not sure Joe Cunningham's network is as broad as McMaster's was or is. And so I think he's going to have to think pretty hard about what those next steps might be.
Yeah, there's always a Charleston mayor's race coming up too. You never know. But yeah, I mean, with all that name ID too, you almost don't really want to waste it. But of course, difficult statewide, maybe some other races. Joe Cunningham's only 40 years old, so there still remains to see what his political future holds. Like we said, even the governor, after this next term, will be 79. He could still run for something else. We don't know. That's what his campaign maybe alluded to, but 2 terms, 10 years, that's a lot. Let's look at these superintendent of education numbers. Ellen Weaver, the Republican in that race, is leading Democrat Lisa Ellis, 54% to 42%. That's about an 8% margin right there. Again, going to be one of the closer races that we watch tonight. Not all the numbers are in for that race there. Of course, Mark Hammond, Secretary of State, going to be winning an easy re-election there too over his opponent. And we're going to look at some other state treasurer right there. There's Curtis Loftus with a solid 80% right there. But let's go back, Kirk, to what's going on with the governor's race. What really resonated among folks on the campaign trail? We saw Joe Cunningham really trying to push the envelope there with legalizing marijuana, legalizing sports betting to help offset, getting rid of the income tax, giving teachers a higher pay raise. That just didn't seem to fall on the ears of folks in South Carolina the way that Governor McMaster's message of economic prosperity did.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the demographic groups that Cunningham was targeting. He was looking at the younger voters, where legalizing marijuana support for gay marriage, abortion rights, where those things resonate very, very strongly, but where those individuals are a smaller portion of the voting population and also ones that are less likely to turn out and actually cast those votes. Whereas McMaster's message about economic prosperity, serving as a counterpoint to Washington, D.C., that's always a message that resonates with people, especially at a time when if inflation is running really high. That's a message that resonates especially with people 45 years old and older. And those are the reliable voters that come out in large proportions. And so I think McMaster just targeted the population in a very smart way and had a message that resonated with them, unlike what Cunningham was able to pull off.
And when we continue to look at McMaster's trajectory in politics too, we look at 2018 when he had to win outright for his first full term there. That was the hard part for McMaster. He was in I think it was a 5-way primary and then got into a runoff with businessman John Warren. And that's when he called in the big guns. He called in Donald Trump, who he endorsed. Likewise, the man landed Air Force One in a huge rainstorm in Colombia. It was a big deal. But I remember that because he needed that little extra bump. And then when Henry got through that, he was ready to kind of just take off. But then, of course, COVID came, 2020, and he really talked a lot about how he handled COVID on the campaign trail. Even during 2020, I remember hearing these things, we're not going to shut down. We're not doing mandates. You don't have to mask if you don't want to. A lot of these, personal responsibility items that I feel like was not only what the governor wanted, but also was really sending a signal to his base that, hey, I don't need a primary challenge in 2022, So I think, and he avoided that. There was Trucker Bob, but that wasn't a big threat.
Right.
But at the same time, he's really been harping on how he handled COVID.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that was a brilliant strategy on his part because, again, during COVID, to position yourself as anti-Washington, it doesn't matter who's in the White House because Donald Trump was in the White House when that first started. And McMaster was still able to push back and say, look, we're not going to follow any of those mandates. We're going to stay open. We're going to do what's right for South Carolina. And I think that demonstrated both his independence and his leadership, and people remembered that this time around.
It's funny that we're talking about Washington too, Kirk, because, the rallying against Washington, the spending, but then when it comes to the American Rescue Plan, it's like, well, actually, this money isn't too bad. You're telling me you're going to give me $400 million to close the broadband gap in South Carolina, $1 billion to help with roads, adding basically $2 billion for roads, $800 million for fixing rural infrastructure. So the governor touts a lot of those numbers, doesn't necessarily say where that money's coming from on the campaign trail, but why let that get in the way of a good story?
Well, and that's where I would fault someone like Joe Cunningham and some of the other Democratic candidates for not drawing attention to the fact that a lot of the money has come from Joe Biden and his administration, and Republicans have been taking credit for projects that go into the field that have been supported by money that's come from Washington, D.C., that they turn around and campaign against. And the Democrats just haven't really done a good job of reminding voters who provided that money in the first place. And that's a disconnect that I think the Democratic Party has had for years. Their messaging tends to be much more complicated, and it makes it more difficult for people to remember, let alone get excited about.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about the governor's governing style in a moment, but I want to look at some congressional numbers too. We're keeping up on those. Again, the first congressional district race is the one we're really watching, and that's with Dr. Annie Andrews, the Democrat down there, challenging incumbent Republican Nancy Mace. Andrews with 47% of the vote, Mace with about 52% and 17% of the votes being counted right now. That's closing up as we expected. And we're going to see some more numbers. District 2 there, we know Joe Wilson won that race. He's at 61% over Democrat Judd Larkins. In District 5, we know Ralph Norman also won his race at 62% with 46% of the votes being counted. He's going to win another term there. And that's, I think, District 6, Jim Clyburn, of course. They're not calling the race for Jim Clyburn yet, but going for his what did we say, his 16th term? Yeah, so I think it's safe to say we know where that one's going, but he's at 60% right now. Russell Fry, again, the newest member of the congressional delegation in South Carolina, former state representative, now turned congressman once we get this official from the AP, but looking like he'll easily win his first term in Congress right there after defeating incumbent Republican Tom Rice in that primary. That was a big one. We were talking about that one too, but I want to go back to the governor because we know that he has been declared the winner by the Associated Press. We're waiting for the Associated Press to call all of our races tonight like they've been doing since 1848. Yeah, that's a track record right there, folks. Facts matter. But going back to what we're talking about, the governor, his history, he's been around, he has those relationships, and we're seeing those relationships come into action in the State House, unlike what we've seen with his predecessors before. Talking about Nikki Haley, talking about Mark Sanford, always combative with the State House, going back to not taking credit per se, but working together. We've seen that with Governor McMaster, whether it's these big congressional spending bills, or whether it's the voter integrity bill, or even, for his own party, that major victory for them was that 6-week abortion ban last year. Just working with the legislature to get things done and then campaigning on it like he's allowed to.
And that's something that I think McMaster has been very, very smart about, recognizing that in this state, the legislature really holds the majority of political power. Other states, the governor and the legislature sort of share power on a more equal footing. But in South Carolina, it's really the legislature that sort of reigns supreme. Previous governors, Nikki Haley in particular, you mentioned Mark Sanford, they tried to battle with the legislature for that supremacy, and they always lost. McMaster, I think, recognized that battle is not going to gain him any favors and potentially can lose him some political influence. And so he worked very closely and still works closely with members of the legislature, with leaders of the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate, in order to get things done. And I think that has been a remarkable play on his part that has served him very, very well.
And before we talk to some folks in the field, it also goes back to doing things versus just saying things. And we know that our governor is not planning on running for the White House like some other governors, like in Florida or Texas or other states. So that limits the rhetoric. It helps you focus more on getting things done.
Exactly.
So very interesting there. Different governing styles across the United States. Of course, there are a lot of races going on right now, but we're sticking with what's happening in South Carolina. And right now, we're going to go to some of our reporters in the field. Thelisha Eaddy is at the McMaster campaign headquarters. I'm sure it's a jovial, fun environment there. Thelisha, what's it like?
Hey, good evening, Gavin. Yeah, we are downtown. We're in downtown Columbia at the Republican headquarters at the University of South Carolina Alumni Center. We haven't heard yet from newly re-elected Governor Henry McMaster, but he is expected to take the stage soon. What I can tell you is that people here are very excited. We did get the opportunity earlier to talk with Chairman of the Republican Party, Drew McKissick, and he talked about how the party runs and stays really close to the issues that matter to him. And that reminds me of the messaging that Governor Henry McMaster was telling supporters on the campaign trail. He said, if you like what's happening in the state, I'm the guy that will get you more of it. He talked about the millions of dollars that is going to broadband, is going to water and sewer infrastructure, and he celebrated on the campaign trail. He reiterated and celebrated the successes of South Carolina during his tenure, and that's what we get a sense of here when we talk to people like Drew McKissick and also Attorney General Alan Wilson. They talk about what the party has been doing right here in South Carolina, what their supporters expect from them, and what they expect for themselves in the future as they continue to move South Carolina forward. So we wait here for newly reelected Governor Henry McMaster here at the Alumni Center in downtown Columbia. Back to you.
Thanks, Thelisha. Yeah, I know that they want to get him out there soon because it's getting late. It's 9:15-ish, but we'd love to hear from the governor at some point. We'll go to him live when we do, but let's go to Victoria Hansen right now at the Cunningham Casey campaign headquarters in Charleston. Hey, Victoria.
Hey, Gavin. Yes, the music is still bumping here, but perhaps you can see behind me the dance floor has cleared. The music's still pumping, dance floor is cleared. And yeah, the mood has definitely changed here since the race was called just before 9 o'clock tonight. All eyes are now on that empty podium, waiting to see when Joe Cunningham comes out. Of course, I'm sure he will wait for the governor to make his remarks first. But yeah, you can definitely sense the change here. And I heard you guys talking earlier about the younger audience, the younger voters that Cunningham had been targeting. And by the crowd here tonight, that was certainly seen firsthand. A lot of young people here, very excited about the possibility of Cunningham being elected governor, but that did not happen tonight. And a lot of young people, I think, are disappointed, but again, waiting to hear from the former congressman. Back to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, we'll get to that speech when we hear it too. But right now we're going to look at some numbers that have been coming in. Look at that superintendent of education race, which we know is going to be an interesting one to watch. We have Republican Ellen Weaver at 53%, Democrat Lisa Ellis at 42%. Still not many votes in yet at this point, still very early. We'll be watching those numbers come in. When we're looking at the governor's race, we've already just called that for Governor McMaster and Lieutenant Governor Pam Evett. They have 57% of the vote right now to former 1st District Congressman Joe Cunningham and his running mate Tally Casey at 42%. So quite the margin right there, 14 points. I know it's still early, but it'll be something to watch too when we looked at previous reporting. You know, when we go back to 2018, when the governor defeated James Smith, that was about an 8-point margin. Kirk, I don't want to tell you to predict it, but do we think it's going to be single digits? Do we think it's going to be double digits? How do we even know where it's going to go?
I would be surprised if it drops to single digits. I think it's going to stay kind of where we are in the mid-teens. And again, part of it is it's just difficult for Democrats to win statewide races. You mentioned that Smith came close. Shaheen came close against Nikki Haley prior to that. But it is a hard thing for Democrats to win those races. And so McMaster, given the campaign that he ran, the outreach that he has done since he's been governor, I would be surprised if Cunningham polls within single digits. I think a 15 to 18% margin is probably where we're going to end up.
Oh, wow. Be something to see for sure. And I know we just got some news that the AP has called the 7th Congressional District for State Representative Russell Fry, who will be the newest member of our congressional delegation. Like we said, he won his 7-way primary fight in June outright with 51% of the vote at the time. Now he's beating Darrell Scott, the Democrat in that race, at 61%. Again, 38% of the votes being counted at this time. He defeated Tom Rice, who was the incumbent there going for his 6th term. That was a big one. Again, that's because Tom Rice voted to impeach President Trump after the insurrection. Tom Rice just said, I couldn't believe what happened there. You know, if they would have got their hands on Vice President Mike Pence, God knows what would have happened. So he was willing to sacrifice, you know, what he knew was going to happen was, you know, his political fate to stand for what he believed in. So very interesting to see that in this day and age.
Yeah, and if you look at the 10 House members who voted to impeach President Trump, you know, a couple of them retired. They decided they weren't going to run again. Adam Kinzinger from Illinois is probably the most visible of those. But the other ones that stayed on, only one survived a primary out in California, and that's because Donald Trump didn't endorse anyone else. But when he stepped in and endorsed another candidate, the incumbent typically would then lose. And I think Liz Cheney in Wisconsin is probably the biggest example of that. You know, she has been sort of the face of the Republican Party trying to push back against Donald Trump. And as a result, she lost her seat that in an incredibly conservative district in Wisconsin. She comes from an incredibly conservative family. Her father was vice president, among other things. Yeah. There was nothing liberal about Liz Cheney at all, but she stood based on principle, and ultimately that cost her that seat.
Indeed, just like Tom Rice.
Just like Tom Rice.
Another update, too. The Associated Press is calling the 6th Congressional District for Democrat Jim Clyburn, sending him to the House for a 16th term. The 82-year-old will be back, though it will be quite a different House as Democrats are set to lose power there. And Clyburn has been the majority whip since 2019, which made him the 3rd most powerful Democrat in the House, a position of power that he's held while in the majority, while in the minority since 2007. So we'll have some more about Jim Clyburn, but I want to jump to our special guest, Maayan Schechter. She's the politics editor at the state newspaper. Maayan, a lot of news happening since we last talked. We can talk about congressional races, the governor's race, but any news on the State House front that has been jumping out at you and your team right now?
I'm still waiting on results to trickle in, and being here in Richland County, I am always patient this time of year. No, that Richland County has done a good job so far this year. But no, still waiting on results. Last time I checked, the votes were trickling in. Something we didn't talk about earlier was just the number of uncontested state house races going on. As you have mentioned before, most of our state house races were really decided in the June primary, particularly on the Republican side. Most races are not going to be decided tonight, but out of 124 seats, if my counting is correct, 72 of those are uncontested, meaning that the incumbent or the person running for that seat does not have any challenger. So naturally, we're seeing a lot of incumbents, the Speaker, Merle Smith, as an example, cruising to success, to an election night win because they don't face any opposition tonight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some not so surprising situations right there, Mayan. How about the governor's race? What did you think about those results coming in right before 9 o'clock, less than 2 hours after polls closed right there?
That's a pretty good time. I thought maybe it would come in a little bit earlier, just given the fact that he is an incumbent and we saw such an early rush of early voters. But like you all have mentioned tonight, that's not a really big surprise. I think many in the legislature are probably celebrating that too. As again was mentioned, the governor has had a particularly good relationship with lawmakers, including Democrats, who really have felt like he hasn't gotten in their way when they're pushing policy. The governor has been afforded a very good working relationship with legislators. It was noted, I think last night you were there at the governor's last campaign rally where State Senator Katrina Shealy, who has gone kind of head to head with the governor over some issues like cabinet officials, DJJ, said, you know, we don't always get along, but that's okay because at some points we do get along and we're just fine. So I think that we'll see definitely when the governor's budget rolls out, it'll be interesting to see how many of those priorities get pushed in his last 4-year term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting to see Lexington Republican Senator Katrina Shealy at the governor's campaign event. Like we were talking about, having all those campaign officials, all those elected officials on those campaign stops for the governor, 19-stop bus tour there. And, you know, we're talking about abortion. No one mentioned abortion at that rally, but again, it's kind of the elephant in the room because they're going to be taking it up on Wednesday. We already talked about that, Mayan, but before I let you go, I want to ask you about the superintendent of education race. That's a close one, but we're watching. Anyway, you see the win going on that one? It's going to be a close one?
Well, I think it's very much similar to the governor's race. I mean, obviously, this is a state that hasn't elected a Democrat since 2006, which was the superintendent of education race. So certainly Ellen Weaver is probably favored to win this one. Again, a lot of voters also vote straight party ticket. So we'll have to see whether that has a giant influence on this race. And right now, last time I checked, Ellen Weaver was ahead. And I'm assuming that we'll probably see results soon. I would not be surprised. It doesn't feel like that'll be one of those races that holds out to the end of the night, but you know, I've been wrong before.
Well, we appreciate your insight, Mayan Schechter. She's the politics editor at the state newspaper. She's keeping us abreast about what's going on at the state level. Thank you so much, and thanks to your team tonight. I know it's a very busy night. But Kirk, I just want to kind of just jump in. We're going to get some statewide numbers. I think for the 1st congressional district, we're going to bring them up right now because that's one of the most competitive races we're talking about in the congressional sphere. And we're looking at Annie Andrews 52%, Nancy Mace at 46%, 47%. Again, Annie Andrews is the Democratic challenger. Nancy Mace looking for her 2nd term as a Republican representative down in the Low Country. Interesting numbers at 28% of the votes counted. A little bit closer than we thought it would be right now.
Yeah, a little bit. And again, as those numbers start coming in, I expect that Nancy Mace will pick up a lot more votes than Andrews will. But it would be curious if Andrews can pull this off. I think that would be a very significant win, certainly for her, but for the Democratic Party. But I do need to correct the record. So a couple minutes ago, I mentioned that Liz Cheney was from Wisconsin.
Oh, gosh.
She was from Wyoming, right? And part of it was I was looking at Ron Johnson's returns coming in because he's running for re-election in the Senate in Wisconsin and currently is losing that race. And that's a key one to see if the Democrats will stay in control of the Senate because it's just a 50-50 split going on right now. But what we heard kind of going back to the Ellis Weaver campaign, or what we heard was a reference to a lot of people voting straight ticket. And that's a trend that has been growing in South Carolina. I was looking at numbers just the other day, and at the 2020 election, almost 64% of the voters voted straight ticket, either Republican or Democrat. And that's up a couple of points from 2018. And then prior to that, it was only around 50%. So I think we're getting to a point where people are just using that party label to pick everyone down there and not take more time to learn about candidates. You know, maybe they're turned off by a lot of the negative campaigns and commercials that are going on. But if that pattern holds and we have over 60% of the electorate voting straight ticket this time around, I don't think there's any way that Lisa Ellis is going to be able to pull out a victory over Ellen Weaver.
Or any Democrat statewide in the future.
Exactly.
That's hit it, you set it, forget it, walk out, you're done,
Right.
straight party ticket. That's something that's benefited both parties too over the years, of course, but again, more so now the Republican majority.
Right.
We were just talking earlier about how Congressman Jim Clyburn won his 16th term to Congress. He's the third most powerful Democrat, third most powerful lawmaker up in there in the House right now. Again, things will change when we see the shakeout from the results from tonight. These midterm elections will definitely throw a lot of things in disarray for those Democrats. But I want to talk about just the importance, the influence of Jim Clyburn, 82 years old, really made the state for Joe Biden, made the presidency for Joe Biden. We were talking about this earlier. You know, you had Pete Buttigieg winning Iowa. It was a very messy Iowa caucuses. I'm just so glad we don't have caucuses in the state.
I agree.
Like many things. Then you had Bernie Sanders winning New Hampshire. All eyes on South Carolina. Joe Biden came here. When they were still counting the votes in New Hampshire, he said, I'm down, but I'm not out. And that sure enough was the story of Joe Biden, because this was his firewall. He led every poll in the state. And South Carolina it's more of a realistic state when it comes to the overall demographics of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim Clyburn coming out a couple days before that primary here and endorsing Joe Biden really gave Biden the energy that he needed, the momentum that he needed to win the primary here. And then he didn't look back. Well, once he won the primary here, he got additional money that came in, and he was able to use this to go all the way to the White House. And Jim Clyburn has sort of been nicknamed the kingmaker for what he did for Joe Biden. The fact that he cruised to an easy election this time around, in part is because he's in a relatively safe congressional district, but I think it's also a testament to him and his capacity to speak to a wide variety of people. You mentioned he is in the third most powerful position in the House as Majority Whip. That's going to be really interesting come January, because a lot of the younger, more progressive Democrats are mad at people like Clyburn and Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, saying that they're so old, they're out of touch now. And, Clyburn can come back and say, well, if I'm out of touch, then why am I still getting reelected? But that's going to be something the Democratic Party absolutely is going to have to contend with if they lose, the House to the Republicans.
And that was something we heard from Joe Cunningham too. But that age limit, that didn't really do any favors with Jim Clyburn, 82. Cunningham wanted folks to be limited to 72, the governor's 75. But he has brought a lot of money back to South Carolina. But we want to cruise down I-26 and that sprawling 6th congressional district to the 1st congressional district and get some updated numbers, because we see that Nancy Mace has taken the lead there in the 1st congressional. Again, one of the more competitive races that we're watching tonight. Nancy Mace is at 52%. She's the Republican in that race, going for her 2nd term, leading Dr. Annie Andrews there by about 5%, if I can do my math correctly. We know that Lieutenant Governor Pam Evett is at the podium at the Republican Watch Party. We'll cut in when we get the governor's speech. Maybe we'll jump sooner. We're going to wait and see who speaks when. We'll bring those live when we have them. But I want to keep up with Kirk Randazzo here in studio talking about Jim Clyburn. just his influence. And of course, you know, when we talk about what Joe Cunningham called the geriatric oligarchy, I mean, is that necessarily a bad thing, Kirk, when we look at our Strom Thurmonds, our Fritz Hollings, you know, people are going to say maybe Lindsey Graham one day, you know, maybe when we look at McMaster, age versus, you know, what they bring back. I mean, you look at Senator Hugh Leatherman, who just recently died last November, long-serving Senate Finance Committee chairman, still kicking, still, you know, up there at 86. So age versus seniority versus experience, all those things, that confluence.
You know, that I think that's a really tough argument to have. It's a difficult debate because, like you said, on the one hand, that experience, that institutional memory, all of that history, that's a really good thing. And I think of someone like the late Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, who was a wizard at getting things done in the Senate because he knew all of the rules and no one else knew those things.
And that's important.
Right, and that's important. So when you have that institutional memory, that really gives you a tremendous advantage. But at the same time, there comes a point where you could be in that position for so long that it is difficult to accept new ideas. You know, there's talk about whether Joe Biden is too old to be president. And so for Democrats to come out and use that against Republicans, they need to kind of look inward first and really be careful about how they phrase those things. But, you know, and on top of all of that, you then have the unfortunate reality that as we get older, there will come a point in time when we pass away. And I think of someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who many people argued should have retired when Obama was still president so that he could appoint a younger person into her seat. And her argument was, my mind is still sharp. I can do the job. I'm still at the top of my game, which was absolutely true right up until the point that she died. And then that vacancy gave Donald Trump a third appointee in his first term. And a lot of people say that the Supreme Court is now out of touch with the rest of America. Might things have been different if someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg had retired earlier? That's anyone's guess.
And that was such a huge moment there, too. You're talking about like that fall of 2020 with the death of the justice. Senator Lindsey Graham was Judiciary Committee chairman at the time. Huge moment for him, too, as he was up for his reelect, which helped really, I think, cement his win over Jamie Harrison, again, by 10 points. I wonder, you know, we can always look back 2020, but it would have been interesting to see maybe how things would have changed, because that was really an opportunity for him to remind folks, hey, this is what I'm here to do, help get these folks confirmed and through. And we also saw him try to do that in the most recent Supreme Court appointee moment right there with Julie Childs, Judge Childs there, Michelle Childs. Obviously him and, okay, we're going to go to the governor right now who's going to give his speech. Right there, his acceptance speech in Columbia, according to Governor Henry McMaster, talking about winning his second full term as governor of South Carolina.
Everybody happy? This is a big night. This is a big day. This is a great state. It's getting better all the time. As y'all know, this is daughter number one, Mary Rogers. This is her husband, Sam, producer of a brand new South Carolinian named James Dorgan. He's 4.5 months old right now. This is the mama rabbit, started it all right there. Peggy Jean, picked out myself from Spartanburg. Peggy Jean. Henry D. and his wife, Virginia, not here. They got an even newer baby at home, Margot Gray. She's just a little over a month, but she could be here before long. Y'all, this is a great night. We made a lot of progress, and I want to thank you. There are too many people to thank. So I just want to thank everybody who participated. Everybody who worked in this campaign. It was a great campaign. We're on the bus, 19 different stops on the battle bus. Y'all, it's a thrill to go around this state and to see the people of the state, to see the hope in their eyes, the thrill, excuse me, that they have about the future. It is all about the future of South Carolina. And everybody knows that South Carolina is the best place in the whole world to live, work, and raise a family, and to grow up. And that's what it's about. It's about our children. It's about the future. It's about what we're going to do for them. And ladies and gentlemen, we're on a good track right now. South Carolina's booming, and we're going to keep on booming. We're going to keep on booming, booming. Just a few things. We're working. We're getting even better. As you may have heard, this year so far, and the year's not over, we got $5 billion in capital investment from people outside coming into South Carolina. That is a record. We've never done that before. That's because they want to hire the people of South Carolina. They want to invest in the state, in the people of South Carolina to do their work. $5 billion. Because of that, so much money is coming in. We were able to cut taxes. We've cut income taxes, the largest income tax in the history of our state, largest cut, and we're going to keep on cutting. In addition, we've eliminated income tax on retirement pay for our veterans. Our veterans are great people. We want more of them. This is a military state. They make us stronger. We also have cut taxes on small businesses, on unemployment insurance. That's going down. Everything is getting better. What are we doing with that money? We are wisely investing in the right things. We're investing in our people. There's not a child in South Carolina that can't go to kindergarten at 4 years old if they want to, whether they have the money or not, because we're going to pay for it. If you want to go to technical college and get one of the best education and training in the whole world, in our system of 16, the best in the whole world, we got $79 million in scholarships waiting on you right now. You want to go to college, 4-year college, we've frozen tuition, and also we have quadruple scholarships for those going to those colleges. We're going to invest in our people. We're going to invest in our infrastructure. We're putting $2 billion into roads, putting $1 billion into water and sewer, putting $400 million in broadband, and that's just the beginning. We're going to keep on going because we're dependent on the people of South Carolina. They are the greatest in the whole world, and everybody knows it. So when we're doing all that, I just want to remind everyone that we must remember that we live in a most precious environment. Our natural environment is second to none. There's nothing like it, and that's why we have a new Office of Resilience. For the first time, we're going to be sure to take care of our precious natural treasures. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's getting better and better. So in the words of Bonnie Raitt, we got some more years to go. We got more work to do. So let's give them something to talk about. That's what she said. And remember this, if we thought the last few years were good, you just wait till the next, because there's going to be more and more. And like that famous philosopher Tim McGraw said, also a country western singer, I like it, I love it, I want some more of it. Thank you.
Short and sweet right there from the governor, just winning his second term there, full term in office. That was Governor Henry McMaster celebrating there with his wife and his daughter and his son-in-law there. First Lady Peggy McMaster, also known as Mama Rabbit, is what we're getting now. You can see on screen there, he's joined by his running mate, Lieutenant Governor Pam Evatt, and her family and some other folks. Yeah, just a lot of celebration going on tonight down in Columbia at the Republican headquarters there. Of course, the governor, again, talking about some of those big accomplishments we were talking about tonight, Kirk. Even though, it doesn't matter where the money comes from, as long as it's getting used for the betterment of South Carolina. That's been his message, talking about $5 billion in economic development investment this year alone, especially when you look at the expansion efforts of BMW, electric vehicle production in the state. A lot of big things happening. And that's really been the ticket for a lot of these governors recently, too. You think back to Nikki Haley, jobs governor. She got Boeing to the state. Now we're talking about expanding BMW and other things. This is going to be his legacy, it seems like, just continuing that economic development.
Yeah, and that's a great thing for him to build on, because those economic issues, that's what affects people in their everyday wallets. And when folks think about who to vote for, they want to know, how is that going to impact me? How is that going to change my life, make it easier, make it more difficult? And a lot of individuals pay attention to those pocketbook type of issues. And I think McMaster has done a great job of just sort of seizing that momentum, regardless of where the money came from,
Yeah.
seizing that momentum and using it to his credit.
And right now we're looking at the results too. He's leading by about 18%, 17% right now. A lot of the counties still have to report, so it's still very early, but he has been declared the winner. You just heard him giving his acceptance speech there too. Another thing he mentioned, Kirk, was higher education. You're at USC, you know this all too well when it comes to rising costs for tuition. But the legislature, along with the governor, have really been pushing to cap those costs, at least for in-state students, when it comes to preventing these costs from going up and up. When it comes to helping fix up buildings across the campus, for example, that's always an easy way to just bill students, but they've been freezing those tuitions. Do you think that's just another thing you can just chalk up to winning, essentially, that he can help reduce these costs? Not only, maybe it's for a business, but also for students in South Carolina?
Yeah, the higher education funding debate is a very tricky thing to kind of work through, because there's a lot of different moving pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, freezing tuition is important. Again, it's one of those issues that hits everyday people right in the wallet. But at the same time, it's a question of investment in the state, because higher education institutions do a lot of training of the workforce that the governor just touted. This is why companies are coming to South Carolina to invest. It's because of our people. Well, higher education institutions do most of that training, yet at the same time, the investment by the state legislature has been in a decline over the last 15, 20 years. And so it's a tough kind of line to walk. And I think tonight he sort of hinted at that. But certainly there's a lot more that has to be done in order to figure out how best to position things.
And another interesting thing as well is that he talks about scholarships for tech schools too, $79 million, and that's scholarships for folks to get certificates pretty much for free, grant-based scholarships to get high in-demand jobs that these employers are looking for, whether it's a truck driver, whether it's a nursing assistant. The money's there. You can get a job in South Carolina if you really want one. That's really been his message. Education, economic development, and the environment.
Yeah, and those tech schools, I think, are very much in a great position to help deliver on that. So, like you said, the fact that people can go there virtually free of charge and get credentialed in a particular trade and go out and get a job that is a very high-paying kind of job that requires those skills, I think is a really good thing.
Which is why we have such a low unemployment rate in the state, too.
Yeah.
We're going to catch some numbers here, too, for the congressional race. Update you right now, it's about 9:42. We're going to look at the U.S. House district race, first congressional district race right down there in the Low Country. Nancy Mace at about 52%, Annie Andrews at 47%. Again, that close race that we're watching. All the other congressional district races, I believe, have been called for their incumbents at this time. And, of course, Russell Fry in the 7th congressional district winning that one as the newest member of the congressional delegation. We're still watching the superintendent of education race closely. Ellen Weaver, the Republican in that race, has 55% of the vote, and Democrat Lisa Ellis has 41%. So about a 14% margin there. So we're going to be watching that one come in as well. And again, statewide Republican office that's been held by Molly Spearman for the past 2 terms. We don't expect that to change tonight.
No, not at all. And again, I think that was an uphill battle for Lisa Ellis, just simply because of the problems that the Democratic Party has in winning those statewide races.
And Kirk, did you watch that debate? I moderated that debate. If you didn't watch it, that's okay. But I want to say, it was a very civil debate, which I'm all for. We love civil debate. Educational television, that's the whole purpose of what we're here. But I was surprised that we didn't see too many fireworks come out of that debate. The first question we had was about qualifications, and we didn't really see Lisa Ellis pounce on that to jump on Ellen Weaver's. She could have said lack of qualifications with that 6-month master's degree that was so critical to getting into this position in the first place.
Yeah, so I did watch that debate, and I was surprised by that as well. And I think part of that might be the fact that Lisa Ellis is a teacher. She's not a politician. I think Ellen Weaver is closer to the stereotypical politician. But Lisa Ellis had a couple of moments where she could have sort of pounced and really driven home a point, and she just kind of let that go by.
When you really need to make an inroad there as a minority running in a majority Republican state. We're going to go to Thelisha Eaddy. She's at the Republican Watch Party headquarters in Columbia, and she has SCGOP Chairman Drew McKissick with her. Hey, Thelisha.
Hey, Gavin, thanks so much. So we're back. Thank you again for talking with us again. We just heard from Pamela Eaddy and newly re-elected Governor Henry McMaster. What are your thoughts?
Well, we're excited. I mean, it's exactly what we thought would happen. They called this race really, really early because of the great margins that the governor ran up all around the state. And I attribute that to his message and the excitement that it generated and his track record. And it's exactly what we thought would happen.
You know, in the background, he and the governor mentioned it from the stage. In the background, we heard that Tim McGraw song, I like it, I love it, I want some more of it. We heard that a lot from him on the campaign trail. He says, if you like what's happening in South Carolina, I'm the guy that can get you more. And from the stage, he talked about the money that's going to broadband and the money that's going to sewer and water infrastructure. And our ports down in Charleston, now celebrated as the deepest in the Atlantic. When it comes to the issues that matter to the party, what's to come? What can South Carolinians that already align with you and those that are maybe on the fence, what can they look forward to?
Well, I think you're going to see more of what we've been doing. You know, when something's broke, you don't fix it. We've had a message that has been resonating with voters around the state for a long time. That's led to decades of growth of the Republican Party in this state. And the governor is the latest iteration of that now. And just, you know, in this year, economically, we've had, $5.7 billion worth of economic growth in South Carolina this year. That's fantastic. We've got 2 months left to go in the year. Tax cuts, I mean, you name it, those things are resonating with voters.
One more race we're waiting on. How do you feel about this education race?
Good. Feel good. I mean, you know, you expect races like that to be a little tighter because it's an open seat. But still, with the way our votes are tracking around the state, we feel real confident.
Drew McKissick, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Thelisha, for that report. Always great to have top party officials talking with us on air tonight. We appreciate that as well. Kirk, back in studio. Talk about what you're going to be looking for when we get all this data settled. You know, we're looking at SC votes. It's still very early. Data takes a while to settle down. But what are you going to be looking at in terms of where we are as a state politically after we see the final results certified?
So I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to me is how the vote broke out according to demographics, both in terms of race, gender, but also just age. And in part because campaigns like Joe Cunningham that targeted younger voters, I'm curious to see the extent to which they turned out. In terms of race, I'm going to be very curious to see the extent to which African Americans turned out. And so those kinds of demographic patterns sort of signal the extent to which the state is solidly red, trending purple, something along those lines. And, you know, we had mentioned earlier, you know, the difference between South Carolina and, say, our neighboring states, North Carolina, Georgia, that are much more toss-up, sort of purple kinds of states. South Carolina has not followed those patterns. And so that's kind of curious to try and figure out what is it in South Carolina that has kept it more in the solidly red column. And as those voting returns come in, that might provide some clues.
And it's interesting, too, when we talk about our demographics when it comes to politics, too. And we can also talk about early in-person voting, which is the first election we've had this, first general election we've had this on the books since the legislature passed it in May. We saw it happen in the primary as well, but we had 560,000 South Carolinians, more than that, vote in person early in this past election, which is brand new. We also saw about 51,500 absentee ballots cast. There's about 3.3 million registered voters in South Carolina. So interesting to see that. We're going to be seeing more people vote in person. Again, that bill was passed early. You can look at the top 10 early voting counties in our state. Charleston had 67,000 folks vote early, then Horry, Greenville, Richland, Lexington. So the bigger counties right there, obviously turning folks out. But Horry, you know, that's one of the fastest growing places. Myrtle Beach, one of the fastest growing cities in the state, in the country as well. that's also at play too, Kirk, when it comes to people relocating here. I mean, I brought my dad, my stepmom down from Maryland, so I can also claim folks moving here too. So is that also changing, obviously, our demographics as well? Who's coming from where, what their beliefs are?
Yeah, I think having the no excuse early voting option in place has been very popular, and I think we are only going to see that grow and become more popular as elections continue, in part because, a lot of businesses don't give people the day off to go vote, so they have to figure out if they can squeeze it in during their lunch break or on their way into work or on their way home. And having the early voting option just gives so much more flexibility to people in order to make sure that they can cast that vote. And I think that's especially true for individuals that are in the working class, that may be getting paid by the hour. To take time off means you're not getting paid. And that's a really tough decision to make. Giving individuals a flexibility to vote based on their schedules, I think, has been an absolutely fantastic thing. And that might influence more people to move into this state because they know that they have that additional flexibility. And that goes to what the governor was saying about investing in people and having businesses come in and invest. If that flexibility is there, it just makes life a whole lot easier.
And we know there's a lot of building and construction going on in those areas too, the coastal areas too. I was in Horry County during the primary, and you just drive around and there are just, condo complexes being built, apartment complexes, new builds, industry going there. Same thing when you go down the coast as well to Charleston. Of course, you go on the peninsula. I mean, there's always something going up too. I'm not saying it's affordable housing, but it's housing for somebody, right. Which at the same time is also indicative of who is moving into those buildings too. So older folks, maybe retirees, maybe people with a little bit more disposable income, whereas other folks who are working class actually helping support the backbone of these economies, these tourism-based economies being pushed further and further out. No one's really given an explanation or a way to fix this problem that continues to be pretty pervasive up and down the coast.
Yeah, and along with that, we also see the additional investment in just broader infrastructure, kinds of like widening the interstates and allowing people to travel more easily to different parts of the state. The increase in broadband connection and things like that. I think all of that investment will make this state even more attractive for people to come visit, and then if they come visit, potentially move here because they like what they see.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that happening too, and you hear from SCDOT Secretary Christy Hall, who, ever since they passed that gas tax in 2017, has taken the ball and run with it. And even though the governor was against it at the time, he's still out there supporting all these expansion efforts, talking about the I-26. We're going to be having, 3 lanes all the way from Columbia down to Charleston at some point soon. There's expansion going on at Malfunction Junction up here. I mean, there's a lot of growth that will be happening over the next couple of years. So even if we do see a recession nationwide, it will be safe to say that we're going to be a little insulated here in South Carolina. We have a low unemployment rate. There are more than 100,000 jobs available to folks. We'll have infrastructure jobs for years to come, whether it be broadband or construction jobs. So a pretty positive place to be right now.
Yeah, and in addition to all of that, we haven't seen the explosion in housing prices. On average, we certainly have that in certain parts of the state, but on average, housing prices have still remained relatively reasonable compared to other parts of the country. And I think that will just help people decide to potentially move here.
Kirk, we have about 7 minutes left, but I want to talk about 2024.
Sure.
Because that's the next question now, is who's going to run for what. We expect to hear from former President Donald Trump next week. A big announcement.
Big announcement.
Huge. But we'll see what it's going to be about. Obviously, that will be a big moment in this race. Obviously, South Carolina plays a pivotal role when it comes to choosing presidents, both Democrats and Republicans. We talked about picking Democrats, but the Republican primary will be also important too, especially if this becomes a wide open one. And we're talking about Tim Scott. We're talking about Nikki Haley. We saw Tom Cotton, the Arkansas senator, already say that he's not running. So we're already seeing all the positioning happening. We've seen it on the campaign trail. What are you watching now, November 9th?
Yeah, and in addition to all those names, you have Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's going to cruise to his second term as well. I think a lot of it is really going to depend on what Donald Trump does. And the big announcement next week, everybody assumes it will be that he is going to run for the presidency in 24. Part of that is also going to hinge on whether indictments come out. You know, he's under investigation, both federal and state, and any one of those indictments could put his ability to run in jeopardy. There have been hints that if he announces on the 15th, there will be lawsuits filed under the 14th Amendment to prevent him from holding a federal office again because of his role in the January 6th insurrection. So that's going to be really interesting to see. And once he moves, the next question is all these other Republican possibilities, what do they do? Do they run against him, or do they just simply get out of the way and wait until 28? But also on the Democratic side, it's not entirely clear that Joe Biden is going to run again. I know that he would like to, and I think for the Democratic Party, several individuals would like him to, but age is going to become a factor. I mean, it's already an issue right now, and it will only get worse a couple years from now. And so if Biden runs, will someone challenge him in a primary? We haven't seen that in decades, but that is a possibility. And if he decides to step away, who comes in to fill that void? Is it a Kamala Harris? Is it one of the governors that are around? I mean, there's no real heir apparent in the Democratic Party that could step up and fill that void.
And you talk about Pete Buttigieg too.
Pete
Department of Transportation.
Buttigieg, absolutely.
But again, getting that traction in South Carolina will be key, regardless of what happens too. And of course, we're still waiting to see what the Democratic Party does in terms of the calendar, the nominating calendar too. South Carolina could move up at some
to the front.
Please, oh God, it's already so much already. But we'll see that too. We have a few moments left here, and I just want to do a quick recap before we get out, folks. Looking at some of races that we're still waiting on final numbers from. We're looking at the first congressional district race there with Democrat Dr. Andy Andrews at 47% and Republican Nancy Mace at 52% too. That race has not been called yet. We'll be watching that one throughout the night as we wait more folks to be counted there. And then Superintendent of Education with Republican Ellen Weaver leading Democrat Lisa Ellis 53 to 41, 42% there. So again, those races haven't been called yet. We have seen the congressional district races already play out as expected for the incumbents and State Representative Russell Fry winning the 7th Congressional District. We're going to be keeping an eye on some State House races. There's some interesting things happening there as well. You can always follow along at scetv.org/elections. We have a great tally right there. You can also go to scvotes.gov. There's a lot of information there too as these returns come in throughout the night. It's almost 10 o'clock. Kirk Randazzo with USC. You've been a great treat to have on set tonight. Really breaking through things. We have about 2 more minutes left. Final takeaways, I guess, no real surprises here in South Carolina yet. I guess we could maybe just go ahead and hedge that. Of course, we were expecting things to kind of go the way for Republicans tonight. Yeah, I think for our state, things played out pretty much the way that we expected going into it. I think the question is, in terms of the rest of the country, how things play out with how closely the Senate is divided. I've been looking at some of those races. They've been flipping back and forth, especially the one in Georgia between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. And so those national dynamics, I think, are kind of the next question to pay attention to. A lot of races to watch nationwide, of course, and we're going to be watching those. Not all the results will be in tonight. You know, that's okay. That's how elections work. It takes time to get things counted. Doesn't mean that things are going wrong. So far, state elections in South Carolina sounds like it's been pretty easy. Typical issues as you'll get with an election, but that's what it is. But that's where we stand right now. Again, top headlines: Governor Henry McMaster won his second term tonight, and U.S. Senator Tim Scott won his next stint in the Senate as well. And of course, our congressional district members holding on to their seats, with Russell Fry going to Congress as the newest member of our delegation. And I want to go ahead and thank all of our guests for joining us tonight. And thanks to Thelisha and Victoria in the field there at those watch parties tonight. And thank you everyone at South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio. Thank you to Kurt Randazzo with USC. It's been wonderful. You can follow along on scetv.org/elections. I'm Gavin Jackson. Good night, folks.